in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast.
Do as much as possible for as long as possible. That is literally what the second threshold is trying to define, right? People talk about pH, blood lactate, this and that, but that's really what we're trying to decipher is how much effort, what kind of intensity are we able to maintain for as long as possible?
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Dr. Robbie Jacobs, where we're going to talk all things thresholds. This is going to be a multi-part series where we talk, I think, second threshold first, and then work into first thresholds, and we're just going to make this a really, really long, continued, podcast episode. Dr. Robbie Jacobs, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. And I noticed there's a teaser on the first thresholds, plural.
Oh, that might have been an inadvertent teaser, but yeah,
you were
being
subtly insinuating that. I mean, I like that. I like that. I thought that was the right way to introduce it.
I think one of the things that a lot of people get confused about is this, they're thresholds, right? Just thresholds in general. There's a first threshold that's trying to delineate between, some physiology. And then there's the second threshold that we talk about that's generally equated to endurance performance. It's this delineation point between sustainable and unsustainable exercise intensity. And, depending who you ask, depending on what forms you're in, depending if you're a runner, if you're a cyclist, if you're a skier, you're going to get different answers of what's the best way to try to measure this, try to estimate it. There's a great paper that tries to kind of get at this a little bit, and it's a review by Andy Jones and a group of really, really amazing scientists. And they talk about this second threshold, and how you'll hear it defined, or not defined, but described as lactate threshold, onset of blood lactate, maximal lactate steady state, respiratory compensation point, second inflection in near infrared spectroscopy, or SMO2, critical power, critical speed. It's like, well, what the heck? If we have, I don't know how many terms that was, 10 or 15 of them. If we have 10 or 15 terms for this one thing, my definition of second threshold is the delineation between sustainable and unsustainable exercise intensity. And I think that's important because it's not time based, at least for now. And we might change this up in a little bit, but it's not time based, but people take it as time based. Like an FTP test, functional threshold power test, for example, is typically done for either 30 minutes or 60 minutes. And then you say, okay, well, your functional threshold power is this, 280 watts, something like that. That's your functional threshold power for 30 or 60 minutes. If you try to do 2 hours, your functional threshold power has to go lower. And I think
how come? Why does it have to go lower?
It has to go lower because you're there. I mean, a lot of factors. You're going to be heating up the entire time, probably dehydrating yourself if you're not taking in enough liquid, which is going to put higher cardiovascular strain on your body. You're going to be depleting glycogen because you're exercising at an intensity that's going to require a lot of carbohydrate oxidation. So you're going to have to slow down because the rate of ATP production that you can actually sustain over that amount of time is going to have to be lower because you have limited amounts of ATP production coming from phosphocreatine and glycogen. And, to some extent, quote unquote, unlimited amounts coming from fat. But as we've talked about on this podcast, like numerous times, the only time you're oxidizing almost purely fat is in this sort of situation, or if you're walking, biking, running at very, very, very low intensities. Like I'm talking like a stroll in the park, or, just like walking at your desk, something like that. Um, so, so I think all of that kind of brings a lot of confusion to thresholds, especially. And what we're going to focus on today is the second threshold, that delineation between sustainable and unsustainable. Because again, I just poked holes in this idea. It's like, well, sustainable and unsustainable is dependent on the time that you're actually going to be exercising. And I love Robbie's definition of, or maybe not definition of second threshold, but maybe the two thresholds we're really worried about are that first threshold, that transition point from maximal fat oxidation to more carbohydrate oxidation, and VO2 max. Maybe those are really the two like kind of hard transition points that we have. And then the second threshold is on a continuum, depending on what your exercise requirement is going to be, how long you're supposed to be exercising.
I just came up with another name for the second threshold. This will be mine, but this along with all those others that you just threw in there, hopefully is going to help clarify some things. I'm going to start referring to the second threshold as DAMA FLAP. It's an acronym for do as much as possible for as long as possible.
DAMA flap.
DAMA flap. Do as much as possible for as long as possible. That is literally what the second threshold is trying to define, right? People talk about pH, blood lactate, this and that, but that's really what we're trying to decipher is how much effort, what kind of intensity are we able to maintain for as long as possible?
Yep.
That's what we're really trying to figure out with the second threshold, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. The second,
and I think that's why there's so much confusion.
Yeah, there's so much confusion because we kind of do this hand wavy thing. Oh, it's this, it's the transition point between sustainable and unsustainable. And typically, if we're looking at actual endurance performance, most in endurance, like what we, count as endurance, is going to last 30 to 90 minutes, I would say, is like, for the most part. But you also have your 5K runners, your 1500 meter runners, even a 10K runner can be faster than those 30 minutes. You also, on the flip side of things, you have your like marathons are much longer than an hour and a half, even for the elite level athletes. And then you start to have, then you start to get into this like ultra marathon, Ironman, half Ironman, like events that can last up to 12, maybe 16 hours. And what is sustainable? You couldn't go out like, for example, like if we talk about unsustainable to sustainable, that gives us this idea that, oh, well, if I'm just exercising in that sustainable zone, that should be sustainable for everything, right? No, there's a caveat. It's sustainable for however long you have enough energy preserves on board, or if you're, low, like continually hydrated. So what do you call it? DAMA flap?
Yeah. It's like, yeah. The P for do as much as possible for, that's where we got a workshop. Maybe DAMA flap or something.
But no.
Well, I mean, everybody kind of understands, like if you were asked to run 10 feet, 10 meters as fast as you could, and then you were asked to run that same speed for a mile, you'd be like, that's crazy. We already understand this to a certain extent. What differentiating these thresholds kind of is intended is to help somebody kind of prioritize or plan ahead of time when you are exercising for 90 minutes to 2 hours, so that you have an idea of, you don't go out too hard and kind of screw up your chances of getting a better time, completing it faster, doing better, getting a higher average power, all that.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely, it's a planning perspective thing, right? We're trying to pinpoint, what's going to give us the best opportunity for the best output on any given day. And I think it's really important to, really just understand. It's like, well, a lot of the times this stuff is like how we test is done in a lab. It's based on a single response variable, right? We can measure it, like I said earlier, ventilation. So you can either have your CO2 breakpoints, right? You can even have oxygen breakpoints, because oxygen breakpoints are going to change as well. You can have your lactate breakpoints, which are heavily ingrained, for some reason in a lot of sport. And I say for some reason because, when I was doing my master's degree, Dr. Jacobs asked me, he was like, "Hey, can you give a demo to some of our nutrition students about, doing some lactate testing and stuff like that?" So I went down, grabbed our lactate meters, grabbed the test strips and like all of this sort of stuff. Didn't really know too much about it, but I was like, okay, well, lactate should be easy to measure because it's so ubiquitously used across sports performance that, you just prick your finger, you just prick your earlobe, and then you just measure what's in the blood. I was getting values that were like 1 millimole and then 1.5 millimole. And then I'd get pissed off because like it hurts and it would be like 6 millimole. And then I'd squeeze a little hard and it'd be 7.5 millimole. And this is all just in a resting position where you'd expect 1 to 2 millimole. But at the same time, it's also affected by, are you hydrated? It's also affected by how much carbohydrate did you just eat? Because if you ate a lot of carbohydrate before measuring this, then you're going to have a lot of lactate circulating in your body because you're just doing a lot of glycolysis. Insulin pushes your body to break down more glucose. So it's highly dependent on the environment, and then it's a static measure as well. So it's not even something that is like, oh, well, we're continuously measuring it so we can see trends. We're like, for a 30 to 45 to an hour long step test, you're doing one sample every step, which really takes away the granularity in your ability to actually detect, say, inflection points or turn points, as it were. So that was, and I'm going to get Andrew Sellers on the podcast at some point. I recently had a conversation with him, so I'm hoping that podcast comes out before this one, but who knows? But I'm going to get him on the podcast because he's disconnected from research, but as a coach, he's grown up and used lactate and all of that, and he's just like, yeah, lactate's useless. And I'm paraphrasing kind of how, but I want to get him on, and I want to get him to defend his answer because I am leaning towards that side. I still think there's some usefulness in it, but I think the way that it's applied is much more simplistic than really what lactate is telling us. So that was a long divergence of I just don't think the bottom line is I don't think relying on one variable to tell us whether our body is in a sustainable or unsustainable exercise intensity is actually appropriate. I think we need more to make that model better.
Yeah. And consider, like, what's your fastest mile? It was like 440?
440, yeah.
Could you have done 2 miles at that?
Absolutely not. My fastest 2 mile was like just under 5-minute miles. So it was like,
see, so I mean, we understand this. Mm-hmm. There is a relationship with intensity and time. As time goes on, that we are at a certain intensity, there's changes biologically mm-hmm. that may not allow us to maintain that. And so we understand that, right?
Yeah, it's somebody, Lexi Kelson, who's a nutritionist down in Atlanta, who's on the podcast as well, said something the other day that really resonated well with me. Is most of the time, what is practical becomes optimal. And like that was like one of like it was just like, oh my gosh, like that is so poignant because and I use this example all the time. It's like if a study came out that was like, oh, if you swim 30 minutes a day in a pool that's 65 degrees at 5 a.m. every single morning, that gives you like, the best outcome for longevity, for blood markers, for everything like that. It's like truly, proven to be the optimal exercise for somebody. If you don't have a pool near you, if you can't swim, if getting in the pool at 5 a.m. gives you anxiety and other mental blocks and stuff like that, then that is obviously not optimal for you. You need something that is practical in order to truly have it be optimal. So it's a weird divergence because this whole podcast is about optimization, but I think it also falls into this pattern where we as researchers are trying to figure out what's optimal for most people. And then for you as an athlete, you as a coach, you have to figure out what's practical and then use that in your determination of, whatever it is that you're trying to do. So we're being, I think, pretty critical of the ways that second threshold is being measured. And the reason is because, I mean, personally, I don't think a lot of the stuff that's recommended for research is actually practical. And that's where a big disconnect actually is.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's where the ivory tower metaphor comes from.
The porcelain tower.
Yeah, the academics. Yeah, exactly. It feels more and more like that. Academics become detached from how the real world works, right? Because we live in these controlled environments, testing things in isolation or what's it called? A reductionism, reductionist. It's true. Sometimes, especially if we don't have an attachment to the real world, we can definitely lose sight of the white rabbit.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And so that's not to say, again, like I'll kind of pivot back and say, like research is really important because it gives us the capabilities of like what the body is actually capable of. So for a perfect example of this is how to improve VO2 max, right? There's tons and tons of protocols out there that are looking at how to best improve VO2 max. And, some of the studies say 4 minutes on, 3 minutes off, or 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off is going to be the best way. And then they do it every other day for 2 to 3 to 4 weeks. That's not optimal for most people because it's not practical, right? You wouldn't, unless you're in that study, you wouldn't go and just continue to do a VO2 max training like that because it's totally unsustainable. But it tells us, okay, if we actually just focused on VO2 max training for the next 4 weeks, and that's all we did, this is the capability of how much we could raise it just based on that protocol. So I do think that there is so much value we can get out of like the research and everything. We just have to take that, tweak it a little bit, make it more practical for ourselves. And, then just live with, kind of like that, not consequence, but that, it's not going to be, a lab setting. That's the bottom line. So let's get back to though, this argument that is kind of posed within the academic literature that, we're trying to define sustainable to unsustainable. Generally speaking, what people call the gold standard, and probably inappropriately call the gold standard. Generally what happens in research is that, people who first coin whatever, term it is, that's what's deemed the gold standard. Like DEXA for body fat percentage, right, is deemed the gold standard. But if you talk to somebody who's actually steeped in body composition, they're like, yeah, all of them have their, their pros and cons, and all of them have, like their errors and all of that. So I think it's on us as researchers. Don't call something a gold standard, but call out something for what it's good for what it's bad for. So the gold standard, quote unquote, gold standard for second threshold identification is, at least according to this research article that I'll put in the show notes, is maximal lactate steady state. And the way that it's measured is an athlete would do a ramp test, so a VO2 max test, and they'd be measuring lactate the entire way, maybe ventilation variables, then you, as the researcher, would say, okay, well, we identify from all this previous research that your second threshold is probably around 280 watts. Then what you do actually to figure out if you're actually at maximal lactate steady state or maximal metabolic steady state, because that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to determine where your body can actually reestablish homeostasis from a metabolic standpoint. And lactate is a metabolite, so lactate is a good surrogate for maybe telling us, are we at maximal metabolic steady state? So then you come in and you do repeated 30-minute time trials. And you'll come in one day, you'll do it at a certain power output, generally, kind of below whatever we had determined as that second threshold from a VO2 max test. And you get your lactate values measured, hopefully every five plus minutes. Like you want to have pretty good granularity here. And then what you do is you say, okay, well, the definition of maximal lactate steady state is less than a 1 millimolar rise from the 10-minute to the 30-minute mark. So, you're trying to say, okay, well, we're minimizing deviations in lactate homeostasis. That's like the big thing. So if you reach it too fast, then you have to bump it up and you have to come in the next day and you have to do, say 5 or 20 watts higher or something like that. And then if you come in and you still reach a plateau, then you come in the next day and you do the same exact test. And then you eventually get to a point where you bump up and you go over that maximal lactate steady state. So say, for example, if 280 was our maximal metabolic steady state, we came in one day, did 270, we're going to reach a plateau. Then the next day came in and did 290, then, you shouldn't be within that 1 millimolar change. Like that's the idea. But at the end of the day, that's already what, like four tests. You did a VO2 max test plus maybe like 4 or 5 days of maximal lactate steady state. So from a practical perspective, identifying maximal lactate steady state is actually pretty tough and pretty arduous on participant, on the athlete. Not many people are going to be able to do that.
Ideal for 30 minutes of exercise.
Yeah. Yes.
Right? Because maximal lactate steady state. What is steady here? Because at the second threshold, when you're looking biologically, lots of things are not steady. The only thing that's quote unquote steady, as I'm able to interpret it, is the power output or the speed that's maintained. That's the only quote unquote steady. And we already know that if we're going 30 minutes or an hour, that steady state is going to be different.
Yep. Yes.
A steady state ain't steady.
And and exactly like what you were saying. And that's going to change depending on what variable you're measuring too. So right. We know like heart rate is very, very sensitive to things like it is very sensitive to cardiac drift, especially as you get closer to that second threshold. You see it continue to go up and up and up because it's responding to heat, it's responding to dehydration, it's responding to increases in stress demands and hormones that are circulating within your blood. So, and that's one of the reasons why people actually write off heart rate, is they say, oh, it's just like it's going to change based on everything that's going on. It's like, yeah, that's kind of a good thing, right? You want something that's sensitive enough to tell you when your body is more stressed than when it's not more stressed. So it's all context specific, but so from this review, that's kind of what their definition of maximal lactate steady state is, right? And I just want to read something, from this, and it's a definition of what maximal lactate steady state actually started as. So initially, maximal lactate steady state was considered to occur at a fixed blood lactate level of 2.2 millimoles, or more often 4 millimoles per liter. However, discoveries that absolute blood lactate at maximal lactate steady state varied considerably, both between individuals and between exercise modalities, later led to MLSS being reconsidered to represent the speed or power output at maximal lactate steady state irrespective of absolute blood lactate. And this is something that I just wanted to point out because there's a lot of people out there who are pushing the use of lactate values, but they use absolute values. And that's because, oh, and by the way, this sort of stuff was known early or late 90s. So we've had 23 plus years that it's been known that using, things like 2 millimole, 4 millimole isn't actually adequate and optimal, for most individuals and most populations. So those of you who are out there who are actually using lactate and using those static markers, I highly implore you to actually maybe shift the way you're thinking about those static markers and maybe use a little bit more of the trends if you're going to continue to use lactate. Because even within like the definition of maximal lactate steady state has shifted over time because it's been determined that those, absolute values don't actually match up as well as it was once thought, in the research. So yeah, all in all, that's kind of what maximal lactate steady state is. Again, we're trying to identify maximal metabolic steady state because that's supposed to help tell us what is going to then be sustainable or unsustainable. And again, we'll get to practice.
Sounds silly, right?
Yeah.
Because when you're exercising, you're like, this is unsustainable, or I can sit in here a little bit.
Yeah. And that's what, that's what other people take into account. They're like, well, what about psychological factors? Like, and that's where a lot of research, or there's a contingent of researchers right now who are really getting into like RPE and, trying to identify, okay, where is rating of perceived exertion, how does that correlate with, maximal metabolic steady state and stuff. And it's tough.
Well, so you're very well versed in all of this, and you're also very active, and you also compete. You train a lot, and you do competitions. How do you use these thresholds in your life? Like, do you use them for competition, or do you use them just for training, or like, how do you use them?
Yeah. So I think, and I've been talking to a lot of great people on this podcast, and it's really helped shift kind of like the way that I am actually training. So in the off season and everything like that, I think it's important to train towards changing your physiological variables. Oh, I need to increase my VO2 max. Okay, I'm going to actually do VO2 max training. Oh, I need to shift my second threshold up. I need to do more work around or near second threshold. So it's the way that I use it is I say, okay, if I have, a specific threshold workout. So one of the ones that I actually really like is, like 8 minutes on, 2 minutes off, or the one that I was talking to you about, kind of like that over under sort of idea. And what you'll do is you'll use, that threshold value from, like whatever test you're doing, whatever step test you're doing, and you'll use it as an estimate, on any given day of like where that power output should generally be, because that if you just need to get close to that threshold to create a metabolic milieu that's going to be a stress enough to then cause adaptation. And you need to be there for an extended period of time. That's why VO2 max work, you need to try to get as close to VO2 max as possible for extended periods of time. And you need to accumulate that stress over time in order to push the system higher. So with threshold work, it's like 8 minutes on, 2 minutes off. And you just got to be close to it. So this 8 minutes should feel, if you're, ideally kind of like at or under that threshold, should feel sustainable, right? You should be like, okay, this feels pretty good. And then towards the end, you're like, oh, it's getting pretty hard. Okay, 2 minutes. And in that 2 minute rest, you should be able to rest enough that you can come back and you can hit that same sort of pattern in a sense. Say, if we're going back to the 280 watts, as our threshold, we say, okay, well, you should be able to maintain then 270 or 280 for those 8 minutes, rest 2 minutes, your heart rate should come back down, and then you should be able to do it again. It's just a way of kind of quantifying the longer interval training, because that shorter interval training is going to be more stimulus towards VO2 max. Really short training is going to be stimulus towards like, sprint development. So that's kind of how I use it. But then in practice, like, so if for example, if I wanted to actually know what my sustainable heart rate was, sustainable pace was, I would go out and simulate what I'm going to be doing on race day. So right now I've just like gotten really obsessed with running up and down this hill on the back of my yard. And it's not
Gross.
it's not a hill. It's like into a canyon, down to a river, and then back up. And it's like 500 feet of
Whoa.
elevation gain. It's awesome. So it's 2 miles total. And what I tell myself is like, okay, well, I want to figure out what the maximal sustainable, like pace is really on any given day. And, it's going to be less if I'm doing one loop than if I'm doing 2 loops or 3 loops or 4 loops, so on and so forth. So I've been slowly building up my, my feel for this, but I just go and I say, okay, well, it's all downhill for the first mile. So I kind of just like kind of let it go, do whatever. And then I try to, pace it up to the top where I'm giving an equal amount of effort from the top to the bottom. And then if you take that and you take the average heart rate, that's probably what your average heart rate is going to be, then for subsequent loops on that day. So you need to kind of recalibrate every single day in order to kind of figure it out. But it's also, most of the time I just throw heart rate out the window. I'm just like, okay, well, this feels sustainable today. Like, I want to try to run this entire time. And so if I have to slow down and make choppier steps, then I'm running the entire time. If I'm feeling good, then I'm going to be going faster. So that's a little bit of like the practical nature of things.
Well, what about in a competition? Wait, first, how do your legs feel after running down, like the next day or two after running down that so many times? Brutal, right? Do you get like super sore?
Not anymore. I think there's evidence to suggest that like after you introduce yourself to eccentric loading, your body adapts to it.
Oh my gosh.
So it's
not mine.
But
I run every Thursday and doesn't even sound like as much downhill running as you do, but I swear for the next 2 days, I feel like I was in an MMA fight.
But I mean, like, we can unpack that too, right? Eccentric loading is going to cause so much more damage than concentric loading. And that's actually when people go and do like the New York City Marathon. Is the New York City Marathon or the Boston Marathon the hillier one? I can't remember, but one of them is super hilly. And I think the first mile starts almost all downhill. And people will come back and they'll be like, oh my gosh, like I feel like somebody took a baseball bat to my legs.
Yeah.
But on top of that too, you're also pounding on pavement the entire way.
Right.
So
that hurts.
Yeah. So it's the combination, right, of a non-pliable surface. I'm running down dirt. I'm just trying to like maintain my balance when I'm going downhill.
Right.
And, not slipping out and other things like that. But no, I definitely like so I do the workout on Wednesday and then I do another workout longer on Saturday. And after Wednesdays, I always do a recovery bike ride. That's my big thing. Because man, dude, my legs were feeling heavy this morning, and typically 180 watts on the bike feels pretty good and is like my quote unquote zone 2 right now. And it felt like I was going through molasses with it. So I was like, okay, well, we're going down to 130 or 140 and we're just going to sit on Instagram and listen and watch YouTube videos and read the articles that we're talking about today.
So another thing is when you are competing, once you're in competition, are you thinking about threshold stuff at all? Or are you just kind of listening to your body and going as it tells you?
Yeah. So this is something that is actually like kind of shifted in my mindset. Is in the beginning of the season, I think you can be you can get away with being non-specific, but focusing on physiological variables. So using things like heart rate, using things like lactate, other things like that to guide your training, because you're trying primarily to increase your physiology at the beginning of the season. Towards racing time, you want to be focusing on paces or power outputs or whatever it is, because the world doesn't care what your heart rate is, during a 5K. You are just trying to get across that finish line as fast as you possibly can. So it makes sense obviously within, like the realms of tolerance, right? Like you're not just going to all of a sudden, oh, well, all my runs have been at, 7-minute mile pace. And now I'm just going to train for a 6-minute mile average 5K. So you're going to be smart about it, but you're going to use all those inputs from that non-specific training to then get more generalized. And I think Jonah, who's an applied physiologist on the podcast, he calls it the funneling. He says, okay, well, if you're training for a marathon, in the beginning of the season, you're going to be doing generally polarized training. You're going to be doing really hard stuff to maybe develop VO2 max. You're going to be doing a lot of volume to develop all of like the ancillary sort of things, right? Capillary density, mitochondrial density, tendon stiffness and tendon tolerance and all of that. And then you're going to slowly take those intervals, go into threshold work, and then go into more of marathon pace work. All of it's getting a little bit slower. Whereas your zone 2 stuff is getting a little bit faster because you're trying to build up that sport specific tolerance of running 26.2 miles really as hard as you possibly can. And at the same time, you're transitioning from physiological measures like, oh, heart rate, lactate, near-infrared spectroscopy to pacing. And you're saying, okay, well, my goal marathon is 3 hours. So I need to run, I think it's like 6:52 or something like that per mile. And, you're trying to get it so that, by the time you hit race day, you're primed to run economically. Your threshold, your second threshold is obviously, or we'll redefine second threshold in a minute, but your sustainable pace is 6:52 for 26.2 miles. And your VO2 max is adequate to be able to support that. So that's, I really like that concept of how to actually train, because I don't think it's not one of those things where it's like, well, I'm just going to listen to physiology the entire time. Yes, you're still looking at heart rate. Yes, you're still looking at, like your lactate values and all of that as you get closer and closer to your race, but it's just not what's actually dictating your performance on that given day. And then, if you're working with a good coach, or if you're, well aware of how your body actually responds to things, you're going to say, okay, well, today 6:52 wasn't it. I was supposed to do a marathon pace and, couldn't even get there. So I'm going to take a rest day today, and then I'm going to do my marathon, pace the day afterwards. So it's way more complicated than just simply identifying your second threshold and then just doing all your training, like at second threshold or whatever.
I just had a thought. Do you think it's better or worse for an individual to be aware of thresholds when they're just starting a sport?
I think at the beginning, when your training age is super young, it doesn't matter.
You just want to kind of learn how to feel your body, right? Like not second or first. You just want to know, like, what am I capable of?
Mm-hmm.
What hurts? Like, what can I do for a long time? What can I do for a short time? Mm-hmm. I just kind of running or riding or rowing, swimming free.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of learn, you pick up on these thresholds indirectly, so that then when you learn about them, you use them, you talk about them, you're like, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think,
right?
Yeah, I think it was best said, or from what I've heard, best said by Norwegian coach Olav Alexander Boo. Olav.
He's your boo.
And yeah, no, he is a phenomenal coach, and he has had great success with Gustav and Christian Blumenfeld. And he says they use testing and physiological variables to recalibrate RPE. And I think that is a very good way of going about it, because there are some people who, given the opportunity, some athletes, they're going to always work out too hard. They just like, some switch is wrong, different in their brain that then compels them to work out too hard. There's other athletes that go a little bit too easy all the time. So by recalibrating and saying, okay, well, we know that this threshold is here, second threshold is here, we need to recalibrate that feeling, and we need to get that RPE to be in sync with what your physiology is actually doing. So I think at the beginning, it is you like, I would not recommend somebody go and do, like physiology testing or something like that. I don't think it's useful. I think maybe to get like benchmarks where you started would be fine, but don't use that in your training. Just, keep it simple. Go out and run, go out and bike a little bit. And, from there, then you can start to say, okay, well, I'm not progressing anymore, or I'm not progressing at the rate that I want to. Then you can start to bring in, your training plan, right? You can start to be a little bit more pointed. Oh, maybe I need to increase my second threshold. I need to increase my VO2 max. So I need to do specific work according to that. And then it gets, like as you get closer and closer to kind of that like elite level, you need to be more structured, and you need to have, there's less room for error. I think that's what it comes down to. So that's kind of like training philosophy and everything like that. And I really don't think, it's not necessary for a lot of people. I think what I recommend for most people is just like, doing something is better than nothing. If you're just starting, just throw on a heart rate monitor, maybe do like, figure out what your max heart rate is, and then just use the zones from there. And that's probably going to help you out more than being so neurotic about, oh, well, if my heart rate's not 132, then this, it's like, because then you're kind of get lost in the minutia and not focusing on like those big rocks that will actually get you the most performance. But then if we guide things back to, this idea of like maximal metabolic steady state, and exactly like how you've been describing it this entire time, you will be able to feel what your maximal metabolic steady state is. And that's going to change based on, like for some individuals, like who are horrible at pacing. I see this in CrossFit actually all the time. They're like, they sprint the first round of the workout, and then they're like, oh my God, I just died. It's like absolutely died during the second round. It's like, slow down the first round, because what you're trying to do, like my best races ever have been where I have been riding that line between this is what's sustainable for this 5K and this is what is not. So for example, the best 5K I've ever run is 16:10. And every single lap I hit, I'm pretty sure it was between 74 and 76. And that's 12 and a half laps around the track. So I was within 1 second essentially of my goal pace, because I'm pretty sure it was 75 was like my goal pace. And I either hit 74 or I hit 76. And it was like, and the feeling when you're actually pacing correctly is like, okay, I feel good. You're only 1 lap in. Of course you're going to feel good. 2 laps in, you get this like steady decline in how you're feeling. You're like, oh my gosh, okay, we get 6 laps in. Whoa, this is like, it's starting to hurt. You get like 9-10 laps in. You're like, dude, this isn't sustainable anymore. This is getting pretty bad. And then coming down the back stretch of the last like 200 meters, my face actually went numb. It was a little cold, but like my face went numb. I started getting tunnel vision, and I was like, okay, this isn't sustainable anymore. And, finished, got 16:10. It was my best time ever, but it was like, absolutely essentially murdered at the end of it. And that's been the case with pretty much everything else I've done, like a fastest ever 2K that I rode, best like longer runs that I've had. It's always been those ones where I've been very, very well paced out. And I think that actually gets us kind of to this idea that's also introduced in this review. And it's the critical power model of sustainable and unsustainable. So really what researchers are trying to do is we're trying to delineate between specific physiological responses during exercise. And, maybe as simply as this sounds, but it's been broken up into 3 different intensity domains. You have a moderate intensity, which is like, your VO2 max levels out, stays steady, extended periods of time. And that's, like the barrier or the threshold there is your first threshold and under. Between your first threshold and your second threshold is what's called the heavy domain. And that's where you actually start to see, if you're measuring gas exchange, you start to see a slow component of VO2 max. So VO2 max or VO2 increases rapidly, and then it slightly increases and then reaches another steady state. Same thing for, like lactate would be, kind of similar. And then anything above, which, is that second transition point, your VO2 max continues to go up, or sorry, your VO2 continues to go up until it reaches max. Your heart rate continues to go up until it reaches max. Your lactate continues to go up. And actually, somebody asked me this the other day, and this was a super good question. They were like, so are you familiar with the concept of VLA max? So like
maximal velocity. Wait,
it's
velocity. Kind of.
So it's the maximal rate, maximal rate of lactate accumulation within the blood.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's a concept that's been, it's from a research perspective, it was developed by, some cycling coaches and cycling researchers. And it's, from a validation standpoint, it's pretty tough, because it's like, okay, well, 20 seconds is going to elicit a different lactate value than 10 seconds, so on and so forth. But it's this idea that you have a non-aerobic, metabolic capacity, and you have an aerobic metabolic capacity. So your VO2 max is that aerobic capacity. Your VLA max is your non-aerobic metabolic capacity. And the idea is, or the question is if you're exercising above that second threshold, are you going to reach VLA max? And my answer was no, because eventually what's going to happen is you're going to be limited by your muscle's ability to contract forcefully. And what drives glycolysis is the need for rapid ATP generation during very, very hard contractions. So lactate doesn't even follow, like VO2 max and heart rate, because it doesn't, like, it's highly dependent on, actually what's going on in terms of contraction. And the whole point of that was that, your lactate's going to respond and get to a high point based on how hard you're contracting and then how long you're holding that contraction. And I just want to iterate to people, and I said it really well in my story yesterday, but I think that I can reiterate this. All blood lactate is telling us, plasma lactate is telling us, is the rate of accumulation, or how much lactate is actually in the blood. And that could be coming from two different sources. You have lactate producers, which is like your type 2A, type 2X muscle fibers. And you have lactate consumers, which is your type 1, or even within, your type 2X and type 2A fibers, you have mitochondria that are going to be able to reconvert that lactate into pyruvate, take in that pyruvate into the mitochondria, and then oxidize it further. So it's the balance between the two. We have no idea how much lactate is actually being uptaken into the mitochondria, and we have no idea how much is actually being produced. We just know what the outcome is. We know what the faucet is giving us into our blood. So that's another thing I want people to be really aware of is, what are these tools telling us? And then what are these tools not telling us? Because I do think, a lot of the times we read a little bit too far into it. But back to the critical power model. So anything above this second threshold is going to essentially tell us, okay, this transition between sustainable and non-sustainable. That's the idea. And where the critical power model comes from is this. It was essentially, I'm pretty sure A.V. Hill was actually one of the ones that first started to notice it, but they plotted the speed at which a certain distance could be covered by humans, animals, like really across like the entire animal kingdom. And what they noticed is this curvilinear or exponential decay in terms of being able to actually sustain. So, when you run 100 meters, right, that power output is super high, or that speed is super high. when you go to try to run a marathon, that speed relatively is super low. And what you can do is you can make lines 100 meters, 200 meters, 400 meters, 1600 meters. And what you see is this curve that eventually comes down and reaches an asymptote. So a bunch of smart researchers back in the day, I don't even know, when the critical power model came about, they noticed this and they said, okay, well, what if we measure somebody's ability to hold a certain amount of power for a certain amount of time? So they started to do multiple time to exhaustion tests, 2 minute, 4 or 5 minute, 8 minute, 12 minute, 15 minute. And even, you could kind of probably get a little bit further on, but you can get enough data from, I say enough data from 4 or 5 time to exhaustion trials. And then what you can do is you can mathematically fit a curve to that data. And you can say, okay, well, we know the asymptote, and that's your critical power. If in an ideal world, because this is mathematical and it's measured just purely off of power, this isn't taking into account any of your physiology, this asymptote, or the where this line intersects a flat line, is going to be 280 watts. Therefore, and this is, I think, where we're drawing a little bit too far of conclusions. Therefore, you should be able to sustain 280 watts for extended periods of time. And this is where like the math and theory kind of falls apart a little bit. Humans aren't machines. If we were, then yes, you should be able to maintain that 280 for forever. But because you're getting hot, you're getting dehydrated, you're running out of glycogen, you're, all of this stress that's actually happening, that 280, that critical power, depending on what research you actually look at, or, like what trials and stuff you actually look at, is really only maintainable for anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes. And this is something we started to notice, right, when we were doing a lot of my work during my master's, is that we do, critical power test. We're going to do it. And then we're going to see how long they can maintain it. And we were like, 15 minutes. Like, what the heck? It's like, no, you should be able to maintain this a lot longer. It's like, dude, exercising at critical power is freaking hard.
Yeah.
So
it's so variable because you're really trying to find that line between sustainable and unsustainable. And that there's not a wide berth to land on that runway.
mm-hmm.
And it's going to vary from day to day, like sleep, nutrition, stress.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of biological factors are going to influence that. It's very precise and very dynamic, right? You said earlier, you said when you're talking about maximal lactate steady state, the measure itself is static. A static measure to try to explain a dynamic function.
Mm-hmm.
It's never going to work perfectly, right?
Yeah, and it's the same thing when, and this is where I generally have a tough time with only prescribing watts to people for cycling purposes. Is like, everyone's like, yes, 200 watts is 200 watts. It doesn't matter if you're at sea level, if you're at altitude, whatever. Yeah, that's 100% true, because it's a mechanical output. But you're not a machine. You're a living being that is responding to the stresses that are occurring. So, for example, if you're exercising at 200 watts at sea level, yeah, maybe that's not a very big stress. But then you go up to, I don't know, like 5,000 feet or a mile. We'll say you go up to a mile. You go up to Denver. The partial pressure of oxygen within the air is significantly reduced. So your body is going to have to work significantly harder to produce that 200 watts. So, from that perspective, it's like, yes, if we're assuming, like I 100% agree that the critical power model is great theoretically, but then it's the application and the practical ability of it. It's almost always going to overestimate, whatever we define as kind of that sustainable power. And but then what they say is that, you can make up for that by measuring the W prime, because the W prime is the amount of work above critical power that you can do. And, it essentially tells you when fatigue is going to occur. But the problem is we can't dynamically measure that. So we we determine, this critical power based on, like maybe 4 or 5 different tests. And the authors do a phenomenal job of giving all the stipulations for actually measuring critical power well. And even then they say, okay, well, the general error is still about 2%. So on any given day, if you did critical power test perfectly and somebody got 300 watts for their critical power, on any given day, it could be 294 or 306. And that's if everything is still held, equal. So that's still a range, right? It's small, but it's still a range. And and again, that's where these things are challenging, right? Because we go into a lab and we get all these tests done, and then we take it essentially as gospel. Oh, this is what your physiology is. I can tell you right now. So I've been fortunate enough to work with Moxie, and what we're doing is we're working with a company called Trainalyzed. And what Trainalyzed does is they take into account, things like they'll take into account lactate values, muscle oxygenation values, heart rate values, power values, and a bunch of other variables that I don't even remember, but it's a long list. And then they'll put it into this physiological model, and they'll tell you, okay, well, based on all of these values, this is probably what your VO2 max is. This is probably what your maximal lactate steady state is. This is probably where your zones are occurring based on all of these inputs. And the more data you have from yourself, the better off that model is going to be. But I can tell you right now, if you're testing in a fatigued state, that those outputs are going to be vastly different than if you are in a fully recovered state. And I'll give a quick examples because I just got some really cool data back. So I heard something about, or I know I was reading an email from Precision Fuel and Hydration. Like they have like the email drips when you sign up for it. I got a sweat test when I went over to Kona, and they were like, okay, well, this is what you need to do before a workout. You need to drink this much electrolyte and this much water, because you need the water to rehydrate, but you also need the electrolytes to, make your osmolarity favorable to pull that water back in. So I was like, okay, let's give that a shot. So I drank, I think it's either 1 or 2 milligrams of sodium along with like the rest of the stuff. And it just comes in packets in a 32-ounce bottle of water. So I essentially took in 32 ounces of water and electrolyte mix before I did this test. My heart rate and all indicators of my physiology and everything like that, I texted you and I said, oh, I hit 340 today. So all of my performance variables were like 40 watts higher than when I tested previously, I think in like June or something like that. And, it was kind of just being willy-nilly. Oh, I'll drink my water in the morning, do that sort of stuff. And that just highlights the differences that you're actually going to see. So, in an ideal world, what you do is you'd say, okay, well, we're going to do a fully optimal, like fully recharged, all that sort of stuff, have some food in your stomach, do those sort of things. And then we're also going to have our fatigue state, because then that'll give you kind of a range and say, oh, well, in a fatigue state, my maximal, for example, my maximal lactate steady state identified by this test is 254 in kind of that like willy-nilly state. But then just based on, and I've been getting more fit, but I don't think I've been getting this much more fit. 258 to 282 is where my second threshold was identified at.
Your fat max is higher than 180. You wow, that's amazing. I bet you should probably feel good sitting at like 210, 215.
And I mean, according to this, right, I do, right? So when I do go and ride, like the 210s, like have that rest for the 220s, I generally feel pretty good. But it's I want to take into that account that variability, right? And it could be, between 170 and 210.
Totally.
But if we just hit in the middle, like we're gonna get most of the adaptations. And I do definitely feel like if I do an hour at, say, I've been doing an hour at about 170 watts, and that's like, okay, my legs are feeling it a little bit. I'm getting a little tired. I'm sweating like crazy because the room that I exercise in, I keep the vent open and then the heat on in the house. And then so it just gets hot. And I'm a furnace when I do it. So it's like, I haven't measured the actual temperature in the room, but it's got to be like 78, 80 degrees compared to the house, which is 66. When I leave, it starts at 66 when I get in there, but I'm getting so warm. And so I think that also, decreases my performance over that hour. But yeah, it's the whole point of that was that, we as researchers are trying to identify, these transition points in order to better help people either identify what their performance is going to be or identify how to train. But we don't do enough. It's just like with any static marker. We can't just take that static marker in a dynamic system like our body, because based on what you're training, how you slept that night, how hydrated you are, how stressed you were from a fight from your partner or not, how stressful work is, other stuff like that. It's this fluctuation. And what you want to try to see, the whole point of trying to optimize and dial into what your zones and what your precise intensity is to see an upward trend. But you're going to see a sine wave in performance the entire time. So that's, I think like the whole point of all of this is like, second threshold is extremely valuable. And there's been a lot of research that has really tried to pinpoint, like where it's occurring and all of that. But we also then have to be aware of what's practical becomes optimal. And for the most part, we're not living lives in a research lab. So you can learn a lot from the research. And I'm thinking about this kind of in like a hierarchy of how to actually apply things. So if you think about it as like a triangle, right? The top portion of the triangle is the research. And that's where you should be getting your ideas from. You should say, okay, well, I'm going to get my ideas from the research, but then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and I'm going to see what other coaches are doing. So it's research, coaching, individual. I'm going to take all the stuff from the research, what it's been showing, how is it actually applied in a coaching setting, whether that's for elite level athletes, whether it's for individual athletes, whether it's, for couch to 5K or, whoever. Then you say, okay, where do I fit in there? How does my body, adapt and apply to this? And how can I take all of this information and then, inform how I'm going to train and make it as optimal as I can for myself? Because at the end of the day, everybody is different. And, it's the old, like people use 220 minus your age for max heart rate. It's like, works for a few people, but in practice, what we see, we don't see researchers using that. We see researchers figuring out what your max heart rate is during a VO2 max test. Or in a coaching perspective, we see, if you don't have access to something along those lines, like physiology testing, you can go and do an incremental speed test or, power test or whatever it is on a bike or on a treadmill or on a track. And you can measure what your max heart rate actually is. So then you take that as the individual and you say, okay, well, this is where my max heart rate, truly is. And it all started with kind of like the research. I guess the research does say, 220 minus your age, like that's where it came from. But it's changed over time to what, 207 minus 0.8 times your age or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's 0.7, but yeah. And that one is a lot more accurate than the 220.
Mm-hmm. But it's still
it's an estimation. And look, what I think you said, performance is like a sine wave. I think you were talking about over days, right?
Yeah. I mean, it could be even,
even in, we talk about it like it's a steady 220, but that's an average.
Mm-hmm.
It may be 224 216,
Mhm.
224,
Or
216.
or even if you're doing like a longer workout or something, you're going to have a good mile, a bad mile, and it's
Yeah.
so, it's up and down all the time. It's like
Yep.
life, right? Like life.
That's how muscle works.
Yeah.
It literally is, because you're going to push hard enough to where you're just going to have some fibers fatigue and they're going to pull off. And so you're going to have to drop down a little bit until that they're recovered and they activate again and they come up. So if you actually look at the highest sustainable power outputs, it's not constant. It is like a sine wave.
Yeah.
That goes up and down and up and down. And so if you notice that and your inability to stick one power, that's okay. Try to figure out, because you can push up your average power by doing that, by going up, down,
And
up, down, up, down.
And have we addressed this on the podcast or not?
We talked about it.
Okay. But this idea of, this is why erg mode is so much harder than just riding, towards like a fixed resistance that you can then change your power output, because your body, again, isn't a machine. It's not built to go just 200 watts. It's built to go 205, 195, 205, 195, or 210, 205, up and down. And, it's like there's so many intriguing questions within that where, it's like, oh, well, does somebody who deviates less have more type 1 fibers, or is somebody who, So, I'll finish us with this. So within the critical power paper, they talk about how important it is for these time to exhaustion trials, and making sure that somebody is within, I think, like 5% of whatever curve that you're building. And if it's not within 5%, then you have to throw out the data, or if they're pacing, you have to throw out the data. So if you're interested in actually trying to do critical power, there's a ton of caveats for actual best outcomes. So also be aware of that, right? Talk about challenges between application or practicality and in the research realm. Critical power model isn't solving any of the challenges that we're already having with maximal lactate steady state, in my opinion. You're still going in and doing time to exhaustion trials, which are notoriously variable. I remember, in Dr. Subuti's class, we talked about, variability and coefficient of variation between, constant power tests, time to exhaustion, other things like that. And like the time to exhaustion ones were like 17%.
The worst.
Yeah. Like the worst ones. So, it's just, again, be aware. And, but there's also, there's the ability to do a 3-minute all out power test. And that's another one we were kind of exploring during my master's degree. And I think it's a brutal freaking test, but it's 3 minutes. So, you only have to do one test. And if you actually know like kind of what you're doing, then in giving it your best effort, then, you get your critical power from that, which is I think it's like the last 60 seconds of the 3-minute test. It's like what your average power is. You should obtain VO2 max. So if you have a gas analyzer, just throw it on somebody and see what their VO2 max is at the end of the test, because you should also maintain that for the last 1.5, 2 minutes of the test. You'll get an indication of what their non-aerobic power reserves is, their W prime, because that's going to be the area. So you have to do a little bit of math and do the integral of the area under the curve.
Maths,
like
they say over in the UK.
You got to do the maths.
You gotta do your math.
But all in all, it's like it can still be a valuable tool. I think all of this sort of stuff is a valuable tool. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to track changes, say you're trying to track changes in your second threshold over time, what you need to do is you need to pick a variable that you're going to measure and pick a process for how you're going to measure it. And you need to repeat that over time. That is going to be the single best way to kind of eliminate noise and other things like that. Don't go from maximal lactate steady state to critical power to ventilatory threshold to lactate threshold to Near's break point. Don't do that. Use the same test over and over and over, whether it's, and make it practical, right? If your goal is to run a fast 5K, then go do periodically a fast 5K on the track. And that's going to tell you what your maximal sustainable pace is for that particular distance on the track. And measure your physiological variables as well, because then that's going to tell you how physiologically you're coping with whatever task that you're doing. So I'll leave you guys with that. You can find me at Critical Oxygen on Instagram. You can still direct all comments to Dr. Robbie Jacobs to me on Instagram, and I will forward them to him on either here or in other conversations. And we'll catch you guys in the next one.